Could you expand on this conception of the struggle for a seizure of power as protracted and finite, specifically regarding the point that that you made earlier, that certain sections of people, specifically the middle strata, can be supportive of the revolution and then actually stop supporting the revolution as conditions change? Specifically, what about the dynamics of capitalist imperialism and war make it so that this happens in this way, even in the middle of a revolutionary situation?
Well, as I said, to start with the protracted and finite point, we used to think that the way to make a revolution in this country, to actually seize power and defeat and dismantle the forces of the ruling class, was to have simultaneous mass uprisings or insurrections in a bunch of cities all over the country, and then somehow coordinate them. And what we had to come to terms with in looking at that was that it would be a very, very rare set of circumstances where the old order would be so completely undermined and its hold over people so completely shattered that they wouldn't be able to concentrate forces, even in a number of cities, and quickly smash a mass insurrectionary armed uprising. So we had to come to terms with that if you tried to do it that way, that it would be in such a compressed period of time that they would be able to just smash every one of those immediately. So, this was something we'd held to for several decades, coming out of the history of the communist movement, where that was the understanding that in a country, imperialist country like this, you did all this work, and then eventually you'd have mass simultaneous uprisings, which would then, people would be armed, and that would quickly topple the regime, and then you could quickly establish a new regime. And what we came to realize was that you wouldn't be able to quickly topple the old ruling class and this whole system in that way. And even if somehow you could, you would be sitting ducks when they regrouped, because you would be trying to establish a regime yourself, or a society and a government yourself in a large part of what had been the old country. And but they would still have a lot of military power, and they would crush you. So we came to the understanding that even when you got a revolutionary situation, you couldn't try to go massively for the seizure of power right away through these simultaneous uprisings, because it would be, look, if it fell into your lap, if the old system were more or less crumbling around itself, and you could seize on that opening and, have millions of people come into the streets with arms and take over, with the right leadership and right direction, fine, great. But you certainly shouldn't count on that, and it's very unlikely that a set of circumstances like that would occur where you'd be able to do that, and then they wouldn't be able to regroup and immediately come right at you and pulverize your attempt to create something new. So it was an understanding that first we had to defeat them somewhat bit by bit, even when you had a revolutionary situation, until the balance of forces shifted. So that's why it had to be protracted, because you had to defeat them bit by bit. The reason it has to be finite is you have a certain, even though you can't go for it all at once, so to speak, you have a definite momentum when you get a revolutionary situation. There's a moment that occurs, and unfortunately, history is littered with examples, of far too many examples anyway, of revolutionary opportunities that have been thrown away, because even the revolutionary leadership failed to recognize that that's what was happening, or failed to act on it. They lost their nerve, or they just didn't have the science to understand, correctly what was actually going on. Or they said, well, if we just wait another year, it'll be even better, and then the moment passed. So you have to be very attuned to this and recognize when there, as I said, when a revolution, and as set out in How We Can Win, when a revolutionary situation is clearly approaching, then you have to, that means a lot of things are going into that, including tens of millions of people in various, forms of upheaval. Not necessarily all organized revolutionary activity, but upheaval. And the old ruling class is reeling politically, even while it's still got a lot of military power. If you think back, I mentioned 1968. If you think back to that period, Henry Kissinger, you know who he is, right? He used to be a big advisor to Nixon when he was president way back in the day. He wrote in one of his memoirs that during the high point of that period, the 60s, a small group of radicals managed to have the political initiative while large sections of the rest of society, as he put it, were paralyzed politically. Well, that's true. It is true that the people who had revolutionary sentiments had the initiative, and all these, yes, assholes out here who were like, you know, wanting to take revenge on that, and Trump supporters, yes, assholes, okay. You know, all those people were on the defensive politically. People who wanted to support the Vietnam War and had supported it were on the defensive because the U.S. wasn't able to win it under the circumstances. So it is true, I mean, it's not as tiny a group of radicals as Kissinger presented. It was millions of people, but who were very revolutionary minded in a broad, you know, kind of not very clearly defined way, but nevertheless revolutionary minded, had the political initiative. But there was no force that had both the ability to recognize that and the ability to organize in relation to it, to lead things where they needed to go. There were revolutionary forces, the Black Panther Party and others, who played a very important role, but they did not have the scientific communism that was needed to recognize what was actually happening here and to make a real go at it by mobilizing and organizing masses of people to do that. So, you know, even though they were the most advanced force at that time, they were nowhere near what was needed. And that's, you know, that's just part of our collective experience that we've had to learn from. You know, we were all, those of us who were a little bit older than some others, were part of that experience, you know, and we've gone through that, and we've tried, done our best to scientifically sum it up so that we don't repeat a situation where here comes a revolutionary situation, or maybe if we work on things the right way, we could develop them to a revolutionary situation, but we're thinking in terms of, oh, you know, let's just do more for the people and they'll get more on our side and eventually we'll have a revolution. So going back to the point about finite then, I'm just sort of setting the stage for that. It has to be finite because you've got this momentum going, you've recognized the situation, and you have to defeat them bit by bit, but if you let it get drawn out too much, they're going to regroup and regain the initiative and regain the allegiance of the middle class. Look, a lot of the middle classes, first of all, there's not one big, you know, undifferentiated blob. There are a lot of different sections among the middle classes, and some of them, the majority of them are white, not all of them are white, especially in today's society. So there are a lot of contradictions there too, that some of them are favorable, some not so favorable in terms of the revolution. But to a large degree, what happens in a revolutionary situation is those political forces that represent, in broad terms, the middle class become, to use Henry Kissinger's reference, become politically paralyzed. They do not have a solution to what's happening in society as things are really sharpening up that people can rally around, because all the illusory solutions that they've offered have been shown both by what people directly experience and by the work of revolutionaries to lead nowhere in terms of where actually solving the problems that are acutely at hand. So a large section of the middle class, it's not that they all flood into the revolution, but they become, like I said, sometimes active supporters, or they have what could be called, and has been called, friendly neutrality. In other words, I'm not going to get in it, but I'm not going to oppose you. I wish you well. Maybe you'll do better than what we have now. I no longer believe in what I used to believe in. You even hear some of that now, but not nearly on a big enough scale and not deeply enough. But that's what happens in a revolutionary situation. And then there is a difference with the youth, even of the middle class, for the reasons that I said. They're not so invested in the way things are, and they're not so convinced that this is the only way things could be. And a lot of them become much more active in the revolution, especially as things sharpen up. So in that situation, if you if this struggle gets drawn out too long, I mean, you can't put a particular time limit. It's not like, okay, you have 18 months and that's it. It's a living, dynamic thing that's, the struggle's going on, things are going on in the world. I mean, people don't think about this, but for example, in the Civil War of the U.S., back in the 1860s, there was a major question of whether Britain was going to intervene in the American Civil War on the side of the Confederacy, the slave states in the South. And had they done so, the Civil War could have gone the other way. But for a number of reasons, including that there was mass opposition in England itself to their becoming allies of the Confederacy, that didn't happen. I'm just citing that to make the point. There's a lot of things that go on. There's not just a neat, straight, narrow road. And you have to, you go back to your point about all the contradictions now. Well, then you have a ton more contradictions that are a lot more intensified. So that's why if you don't have science, you're sunk. I mean, having science doesn't mean you're going to succeed or that you're going to handle everything correctly, but without it, you're sunk because there's all this complexity. So the point is, if you don't maintain the momentum, which is going to be difficult because it's one thing to do a few things, but to actually keep the momentum and keep recruiting new forces, it's not just you start out with fighting forces and they stay the same. You've got to keep recruiting and enlarging your forces. But as I said, you also have to calibrate what they're doing. For example, if you try to field large-scale forces in the early stages of this, two things are going to happen. Say you try to mobilize people, to take up arms in the thousands right away. Two things are going to happen. One, you're going to be much more vulnerable because you're just going to make a much bigger target, to put it simply. Second of all, in terms of being able to melt back into the supporting base, it's going to be much harder. It's one thing you do that with a few hundred. Think about 10,000 people melting back in before the other side can come and annihilate them. So all these kind of things are going to be going on, and you have to fight to maintain the momentum and keep going to where more and more things are breaking off from the ruling class and either becoming neutral or coming over to your side. And then, as long as things are continuing to go in that direction, then it's all right if it keeps going a little bit longer. But if it becomes too stretched out, too protracted, and you lose that momentum, I'm losing my voice, but if you lose that momentum, then you're on the way to defeat. So that's why it's protracted and finite. Then there was another part of your question, too.
What about the dynamics of capitalism and war make it so that people are kind of in and then out in this way?
Well, those dynamics are going to mean that, in the Russian Revolution, after the immediate seizure of power, which was like only a few days in a few big cities, and then they had a whole civil war when the forces of counter-revolution regrouped and attacked them, which lasted several years and was devastating. In that situation, I remember reading about you had this situation in the countryside where peasants would kind of blow with the wind, peasants who were like small farmers who, sort of, they were owners of capital on a very small scale. Maybe they even hired a few laborers, but they weren't big-scale capitalists. So they were sort of they're sort of your middle class there. Well, peasants would blow with the wind. When the Red Army, the Revolutionary Army would come through, they'd put up a picture of Lenin. We're all with the revolution. Then, if it looked like there were a reversal of fortune and the counter-revolutionary forces were advancing, coming through the area, they'd put up a picture of the overthrown Tsar. Like the king. We're patriotic Russians here. No Bolsheviks, no revolutionaries, no communists here. Well, this is kind of typical of the middle class, that they tend to do this. And even sections of the most oppressed people will also, vacillate at times, depending on how much pressure they're under. This is another reason why you have to maintain momentum. Because, even people who really want a different world can only hold out so long if things are continuing to go badly. Only the really, really hardcore people are going to hold out till the end. under those circumstances, even among the most bitterly oppressed who really want something different, radically different. So there's a question of maintaining the momentum and dealing with all the swings and twists and turns in such a way that you strategically advance. And you don't make the mistake, say the whole section of the middle class is with you on Tuesday and against you on Friday. You don't make the mistake then on Saturday when you're back, have a little bit more going for your way. You don't make the mistake of going in and saying, like the mafia or something, okay, you were with the other side on Friday, now get up against the wall. So you don't make that kind of mistake. You have to still work to win over those sections, even though you recognize they're going to swing back and forth. At least you want to politically neutralize them so they aren't supporting the other side. And, there are practical measures also. A lot of the middle strata are deeply, deeply in debt. Well, come the revolution, all that debt is canceled if the revolution wins. So there are even, inducements and enticements to them. It's not what we're relying upon. We're relying upon the whole program of transforming society, but tactically, it's a particular measure. That all, come the new society, those debts you owe to all those bankers and insurance companies and and farming cooperatives that are really just big capitalist enterprises, some of them, that's all canceled. No debt. Well, that's correct to do. Why should they have to pay debt to capitalists who've been overthrown anyway? That'd be ridiculous. But it's also tactically, important. So there are a lot of things that go into doing this. That's why I keep stressing. I know it sounds like I was almost going to use an old metaphor to show how old I am. A broken record. Although I understand records are coming back somewhat. So, but anyway, like something that's stuck, repeating the same thing over and over again. About the importance of being scientific. But really, if with all this complexity, if you are not approaching it scientifically, you're going to be out of it. It's not like this is a magic thing that you're going to always do right if you're struggling to apply science in a consistent way. But you have no chance otherwise if you think about all the complexity that goes into this. And this is why we need, as I said, to bring forward not just one or two, but dozens and eventually hundreds and thousands of people who are capable of being leaders of this revolution on all different levels and are continuing to learn more and lead better as they do. This cannot be made by just a small handful of people. We can start with a relatively small number of people, which we are, but then we have to go out and build this whole thing and get this whole process going where wave after wave, more people are becoming part of the revolution and are learning to become leaders, because everybody can learn this. Now look, I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to pretend that if you've been involved for 6 months, you're going to be able to lead on the same level as someone who's been working at this for decades. And assuming that person who's been working for decades has been working for it in the right way, which gets me to a question you raised about the Cultural Revolution in the party and why we had to have one, because the party had gone off track. And it had lost its revolutionary orientation. Look, one of the things I talked about, the 1968 and that whole period of what's generally referred to as the 1960s or whatever, there was a great revolutionary upheaval then, but then the world changed. There wasn't a revolution in this country. The Vietnam War ended in a certain way that wasn't, in the short run, it was a great defeat for U.S. imperialism and a good thing, a very good thing for the people of the world, but then the way things went in the world was not that the revolutionary people. I remember the first time I met Huey Newton, back in, I don't know when it was, 1966, I guess. And I told the story in my memoir. I went to a cultural program, African-American cultural program at the local community college. And he came up to me because I was, I guess, one of maybe two white people there. And he came up to me and said, "Who are you, Socrates?" Because I had a beard and so on. And I said no, and and I guess he thought I looked philosophical or something. But then I remember we started talking, and he said, "Are you in this group?" And I said, "No." And he said, "That's good, they're not revolutionary." "Are you in that group?" "No." "That's good, they're not revolutionary." But then when he started talking about revolution, the idea he had was sort of that in the third world there was this wave of anti-colonial struggles and revolutionary wars and so on. And so that, as he put it to me then, 2/3 of the people in the world are on our side. So we're bound to win. Well, that was kind of a naive understanding. Look, I don't have time to go into the whole thing, but Huey Newton played a very important and advanced role at a certain period. But all of us were, very undeveloped in our understanding and not approaching things scientifically very much at that point. And when things changed, when this wave of anti-colonial struggles ebbed and turned into something else, and then socialism was lost in China, when capitalism got restored there, which is something that was a major development in the world, although they don't tell you about it in those terms. They act like it's still communist or something because the party still calls itself communist. Anybody can call themselves anything they want. The question is, again, scientifically analyzing what are they actually doing? They've restored capitalism there. That's what they're doing. So they can keep the label communist because it's politically useful to them at this point. But that doesn't mean they are communists. You look at the actual content of what they're doing and scientifically analyze it. So all these things were happening that were, and then there was an assault, a concentrated assault, particularly beginning with the presidency of Ronald Reagan and everything associated with that, beginning in 1980. An assault on everything of the 1960s had been, all the positive things that the 1960s had been about. The struggle against racism and white supremacy and the struggle around women and the right to abortion and the oppression of women, all that, and on and on. All these things came under a concerted attack from a powerful section of the ruling class. And, with all these changes in this country, and they were, doing what we used to call reversing verdicts. In other words, people through the 60s learned a whole lot about the history of this country that I was speaking to at the beginning of my talk here, and about the role of this country in the world. A lot of people learned that stuff, and then there was a concerted attack to say that all that was wrong, and to re-propagandize people with the notion that this is a very special country, a shining city on the hill, American exceptionalism. This country wasn't founded on slavery, it was founded on freedom, all this kind of stuff. And then there was all along that a concerted, determined struggle to slander and distort the experience of socialism, not only in the Soviet Union, but especially in China, which was the most advanced experience we've had of a socialist society, even while there were real shortcomings there. So the effect of all this, we don't live in a, isolated chamber. The revolutionaries and the communists in the world don't live in an isolated chamber where what's happening out there, we go out and try to change the world, but the world doesn't affect us. We're, part of this world and affected by it, and all this kind of, everything I was just describing, wave after wave after wave of counter-revolutionary political and ideological assault on everything positive about the 60s and all the experience of, the great experience of socialism, and in particular China and the Cultural Revolution. All that begins to wear on people, and you start thinking, well, we were for revolution, we're still for revolution, we're still for socialism and communism, but maybe that's going to happen some other time or some other place. Right now, we're just kind of going along, keeping on, raising the banner. And also, people were still skating to a large degree on what had been the understanding coming out of the 60s. I talked about the viewpoint that Huey Newton put forward in talking to me. And it had an influence on me, a positive influence. It pushed me in the direction of revolution, just to be clear. But it wasn't a real correct scientific understanding of what was going on in the world and all the contradictions. And if you came out of that period, here's what you sort of thought if you came out of that period from the 60s. There was this whole wave where more and more people were becoming more and more alienated from and defiant against the system and wanting a radical change and having revolutionary sentiments. It went from, thousands to millions and millions of people. So George W. Bush was part of that generation, but he doesn't count. A whole generation of people went that way, including in the middle class, and the university students. Millions of them. And you kind of, there was a song by, I can't remember the name of the group right now, I'm kind of tired. Quicksilver Messenger Service. This song, What About Me? And it was basically about, look, me, meaning us, we're everywhere. We're in your factories, we're in your schools, we're even in your army. What are you going to do about me? I believe, and I had a line in there, I believe the revolution is close at hand. I mean, this was they weren't quite, Bob Dylan in terms of their impact in society. They weren't quite Jefferson Airplane, if you know about them. But they were a significant group, musical group, that came out of the Bay Area, doing this song about, I believe the revolution is close at hand. And pretty much on right on about what that meant in general terms. But there was kind of this understanding, this is going to keep going and going and going, and more people are going to get with it. And eventually it was just going to become so big that somehow we're just going to kind of, wash them away. I mean, nobody, maybe not everybody certainly would have articulated it exactly that way, but that was sort of the sentiment and the basic understanding. And then when all that ebbed and it didn't happen, people became very disoriented. And even the communists, even in the party, a lot of people were still going along with that kind of outlook, and when that's not what's happening, then you start to doubt everything. Well, maybe we were wrong, since it's the masses of people who make revolution, and the masses of people are not in a revolutionary mood. I guess we're wrong about revolution. All these kind of things, and at a certain point, it became clear to me, if we keep going like this, we're going to throw the whole thing away. And that would be, a tremendous betrayal of the masses of people. Because one of the things that was very positive that did come out of the 60s was that you did have a revolutionary communist party. It was formed out of that whole experience that could play a vanguard role in actually working toward a revolution, the revolution that was needed. And here it was about ready to just totally go down the drain. And what a betrayal that would be. So that's why we had to have a cultural revolution in the party to say, we got to get back on the revolutionary track. And in order to do that, we have to become much more scientific. We have to really scientifically dig into what goes into a revolution. What is the problem and what is the solution? And all of its complexity and all the contradictions that have been talked about. And that's a continuing struggle. And look, the reason that I wanted to do what we're doing here today is because we need a lot of new people to come into this revolution, become part of this revolution, help to solve the problems of the revolution. I know you might be saying, well, how am I going to solve the problems of the revolution? I just heard about this 6 weeks ago. Well, everybody starts somewhere, and everybody has things to contribute. And we really need people to become part of this revolution. And, like I said, people should start with what they, can readily do and feel confident doing, that can contribute and learn more and contribute more and keep advancing. And come in at the point which you are convinced about all of this, including the atheism, come into the party and help to strengthen the party to be the revolutionary vanguard it needs to be. And meanwhile, go out there and work among broader numbers of people, even while you're learning and struggling and determining whether you do agree with all of it. Help bring forward more people to be part of this process so that we can actually very quickly, and I don't mean in a week or a month, but we don't have indefinite time. Look what's going on in the world. So that we can move to where there are thousands of people organized into this revolution. And believe me, if there are thousands of people organized into this revolution, all acting in a unified way. Not, I don't mean like, boo, I think the same thing as you, I don't have any ideas of my own. No. But I mean having a scientific approach, and struggling together to recognize and solve the problems of the revolution. If you have thousands of people who are doing that, you're going to influence and impact the whole society in a very big way. So this is what we need. Look, I've said this before, it has to be understood in the right way, but the millions and billions of suffering people in the world are counting on us even though they don't know it. And a lot of them will tell us that we're wrong and you don't know what you're talking about. I was going to swear, but I've done enough swearing for today. But you don't know what you're talking about. That's not going to get anywhere. Nobody's down with that. Even all those people who tell us that even though they don't know it, they're counting on us in a real sense, because what is represented by what we're talking about and grappling with here is the only way forward out of this madness for these masses, millions and literally billions of people, whether they know it yet or not. So this is a responsibility that we're all called on to take up and contribute in whatever ways we can while we're learning more and struggling with each other and struggling to understand things more deeply and saying what we think is wrong if we think something is wrong and fighting it out. I don't mean this way, but I mean, struggling it out to figure out what's right and how to go forward. This is what we all are called on to do. And to go out and get, what we're called on to do most of all is to go out and bring forward a lot more people to become part of this with us. So I wanted to ask some questions, but do we have time?
We have 29 minutes.
Well, anybody can speak to this who wants to, but I want to ask two questions to people because it would really be important to know this. What is it that, however long you've been part of this, whether years and decades or weeks and months, what is it that drew you to this? And what do you think we need to do to actually bring about what I was just talking about, to actually bring a lot more people into this revolution on the right basis? So if anybody has any thoughts about that, or if you don't have anything you want to say or can get together to say about it right now, it would be very important if you, in the coming days and weeks, talk to people that you do know who are involved, about these two questions, because this is what we really need to go to work on. Is really a lot resides in those two questions. I mean, look, it's the whole thing of being scientific and everything, but a lot of it resides in those two questions. What draws people to this, and what is it we need to do, and what is it we need to break through on in order to bring forward the kind of process that I'm talking about, where wave after wave more people are getting drawn into this?